This and all the free content of Addressing Gettysburg is brought to you by our patrons over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. Become a patron today and help support the show while getting exclusive content made just for you. That's patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. And we thank you in advance.
You're listening to the Addressing Gettysburg podcast.
Okay, I'm taking off my mask here just so you'll be able to hear me, and I have the appropriate distancing. And welcome to the 2022 lecture series. It's been a couple of years since we did this, and we've had some presentations in here and interactions and some live broadcasts here and there over the last couple of years. But the winter lecture series in earnest has not been around for a while, has it? And of course, I was here last winter. I walked in here and it was dark, and somebody said, "Troy's in there mumbling. He's talking to himself." Had wires, and I was trying to. But in any case, it's just a pleasure to be here with you today and start off the winter lecture series. And we hope you'll continue to come out for them and support the park. I know you love the park like we do. And I'm going to begin today by talking about following the 11th Virginia during Pickett's charge. And my focus will be primarily on the step-by-step actions taken by the 11th Virginia in making the charge on the far right wing of the attack. Normally when we do Pickett's charge, we talk about starting at the Virginia Memorial from a southern perspective, and we just walk straight across the field to the angle. And if we do that, we get a perspective of both wings of the attack, the Virginians on the right, the North Carolinians, and various other states on the left from a southern perspective. But we don't actually walk in the footsteps of anyone, because we walk from the Virginia Memorial. Most of the way from the Virginia Memorial to the angle represented a 400-yard gap between the two wings. Now that gap would close by the time they got to the Emmitsburg Road. But if you really want to walk in Pickett's Virginia footsteps, you have to go south of the Virginia Memorial, down to the area of the Florida Monument, and make your way in there. It's a different experience when you come in that way. It really changes your perspective. And so that's what we're going to do today. Now, the 11th Virginia is near and dear to my heart because I'm originally from Lynchburg, Virginia, and I started out in Appomattox in 1984 as a ranger there, and that's just about a 30-minute drive from Lynchburg. So Lynchburg's my hometown. I have relatives that have lived there way back to the early 1900s. And then on, depending on which side of the family we're talking about, my mom or dad, people going back all the way to the early 1800s there. So home for me is Gettysburg, but deep down in my heart, I love Lynchburg. And so the 11th Virginia is one of my favorite regiments. And so we're going to explore them today and go and walk in their footsteps. Should be a unique perspective. And so when we talk about Lynchburg, it came into existence through a charter through the Virginia Commonwealth in 1786. I remember in 1986 there was a big parade in downtown Lynchburg, and there was a reenactor who did John Lynch, and the whole Lynch family was there, and in terms of reenacting, all kinds of floats, and it was the 200th anniversary. They became incorporated as a town in 1805 and incorporated as a city in 1852. And as we look at Lynchburg, you're looking from the Madison Heights side of the city, looking across the James River. The James River ran from Richmond, Virginia, all the way through Appomattox west to Lynchburg. So it was a conduit, a connection. And Lynchburg was connected economically with Richmond and Petersburg, largely because of the James River early on. John Lynch established a ferry across the river, and that's how commerce began at Lynchburg. You can see over to your right, beyond the wooden bridge, a roundhouse. That's for the Virginia-Tennessee Railroad. Lynchburg, by the 1850s, had 3 railroads, and that's why it was important logistically during the Civil War. There was the Virginia-Tennessee line. You know, Longstreet's troops, when they fought at Chickamauga, went through Lynchburg to follow the Virginia-Tennessee line to get into Tennessee. There's also the Orange-Alexandria line, which runs north. And then the third rail line is the South Side Railroad. When Robert E. Lee retreated from Richmond on April 1st and April 2nd, evacuating Richmond and Petersburg, 1865, he followed the James River and the Appomattox River eventually. And then rail lines were also parallel to their movements, largely the South Side Railroad. General Custer intercepted supplies that were being sent to Lynchburg that Southerners were going to eat once they got there. But Custer captured them, and the 30th Corps under Edward Otho Cresap Ord blocked the Southerners in their retreat from Richmond heading west to Lynchburg. They were trying to get to Lynchburg at the end of the war. This is in April of 1865. And board the Virginia-Tennessee line and join up with Johnston in North Carolina and continue on the fight from there. They never made it to Lynchburg because the Union blocked their western retreat along the Richmond-Lynchburg Stage Road, which runs right through the national park there today, Appomattox National Historic Site. But Lynchburg was known for 3 railroads. Also in the 1830s, the Kanawha Canal was built, connecting Richmond to the east with Lynchburg to the west. The canals, prior to steam power, canals were important because if you traveled, you could travel on a river, let's say, down the Mississippi or down the Amazon or down the Nile. But the currents were such you couldn't come back except if you built a canal parallel with the river and you'd have mules pull you back. Also, canals were overflow areas to control the heights of the rivers. So Lynchburg's canal was important. You see on the left, tobacco warehouses. Virginia's wealth was being built off of the growth of tobacco, distribution of tobacco. It was a major hospital center during the war, one of the biggest hospitals of the war. It's called General Hospital No. 3. Because of the railroads, Union and Confederate were cared for there. And there's a cemetery, Old City Cemetery, with graves of both. So it was a major transient point, transportation-wise. Lynchburg was the second wealthiest city per capita family in the United States at that time, and tobacco was largely driving that. Grant in 1864 ordered David Hunter to take it. Hunter went down the valley and he burned VMI, and then he entered the outskirts of Lynchburg. The local people there did some machinations and tricks. They kept running the rail line, which runs parallel to the river. They kept running it back and forth where Hunter could see it from his lookout post. And they would have the same troops continually get off the train, then go to some secretive area, reboard it, and unboard it again to give the impression it was being heavily reinforced. Hunter had already heard rumors that people were after him after the burning of VMI, and caution was the better part of valor. He decided not to attack the city. Grant wanted to take it because, again, there were a lot of storehouse of supplies there that the South was using for textiles, for shoes, for food, and those kinds of things. So it was an important logistical center. It's also known as the City of Seven Hills. Just like ancient Rome had 7 hills, Lynchburg prided itself in having 7 hills. One of them is Garland Hill. You've heard of Samuel Garland. He died at South Mountain on September 14th, 1862, as a prelude to the Battle of Antietam. He was from Lynchburg, and there's a hill named after the Garland family. There's also the Daniels Hill. It was named after, you've heard of Senator John Daniels. He was wounded. They called him the Lame Lion. He was wounded as a major in the wilderness. And the Daniels family, their name is connected with the creation of that hill. There's Garland Hill, Daniels Hill, Federalist Hill, because the city was being established during the Federalist period, during the early Republic, Diamond Hill, College Hill. So those are the 7 hills. If you go to the city, if you haven't been there, the the streets are like this. They're that sharp. It reminds me of Pittsburgh in some ways. You think they should have built an incline to get up and down. It's treacherous in the winter when they have snowfall. And you can see the courthouse at the top. That's a museum today. And it's always the centerpiece of the city. And this is closer 1890s to 1900, showing the city having been improved. You'll notice that the covered bridge was in the first picture. Did you all see that? Covered bridges were common then because if you build a covered bridge, you have mutual support structure. It's a stronger structure. It's likely to hold up better in storms. And then secondly, when horses go across a bridge, they tend to look down if it's heights, and they'll freeze up, and you can't get the horse to move. You have to put blinders on them and so forth. If you build an encasement, a house, a covered bridge, it alleviates that problem. Now, one of the companies in the 11th Virginia from the Lynchburg area was Company E, and they had a number of students from Lynchburg College. Now, Lynchburg is known today for its colleges. It's one of the, you've heard of Fisk and Tuskegee, two of the first African-American universities, colleges established after the Civil War, or right along with that was Virginia Christian Lynchburg College. Essentially, it was Virginia University College, and it was established for African Americans, and it's still there today. There's Central Virginia Community College. For decades, there was Phillips Business College, Randolph College, Sweetbriar College. A lot of senators' daughters go there. There's Liberty University. There's University of Lynchburg. Gettysburg has one college. Actually, there's a branch of Harrisburg Area Community College here. But Lynchburg has multiple colleges. It's really known for its colleges and universities. But the first one doesn't exist anymore. And one of the 7 hills in Lynchburg is known as College Hill. And there's a church on one corner, but it's a vacant lot now. It was established by the Methodist Protestants. It was the first college that they ever established as a denomination in the South. It's split from Madison College in Uniontown, Pennsylvania. They were arguing over sectionalist differences. Half the faculty and half the students were from the South. The parents had sent their kids north to northern schools. And in the 1850s, there were a number of southern colleges, Auburn University is one of them, that were established in the South because of people not wanting their kids to learn the other side. Sectionalist differences were driving the churches apart. The churches sponsored the colleges. So University of Virginia, University of North Carolina, William and Mary, all of these colleges, their ranks were bolstered tremendously in attendance in the 1850s because if you read the Southern newspapers, Southern parents are worried about sending their kids to Northern institutions and having their minds altered. So this college was built. The people of Lynchburg were really excited about it. It was established, it started really in 1856 when the first classes started. But everyone was excited about it because if you read the boosters in the local Lynchburg papers, they say, well, Williamsburg has William and Mary, Lexington has VMI, Charlottesville has University of Virginia, and we have nothing, and we're this wealthy city and we're growing. And they put forward $12,500 and built several buildings just like this one. This picture was taken in 1956. It was the last building standing. It was torn down between 1960 and 1962. But there were multiple buildings that looked like that on what is now a vacant lot. And it existed only for 5 years. It was a byproduct of the sectional differences between North and South. In 1857, there was an economic depression, and the school just went downhill from there. Monies were diverted to other things, and it didn't make it. But it produced a number of students who fought with Company E. And as I've looked through the 11th Virginia roster, there are students all throughout the various companies. So they were primarily in Company E, but more than that. Samuel Garland was one of the early professors. The Blackfords had a presence there. They were on the Board of Trustees. W.W. Blackford was here at Gettysburg. He wrote a really good account. And, Jubal Early is from Lynchburg. There's a Fort Early. I'll just add this as a little bit of a bonus if you go there. That's where eventually he drew his line of defenses. That's where Lynchburgers every year have living history encampments, and the trenches are still there. It's where he resisted against David Hunter after local civilians had stalled until Early could arrive. But Early lived nearby. Now, let's go into the movements then of the 11th Virginia. I'll just say this before we get into this particular quote, that not everyone was from the city proper. There were counties adjacent to Lynchburg, Botetourt County, Campbell County, Fauquier County, Culpeper, and they came to Lynchburg to muster in. So they mixed with Lynchburgians. Lynchburg had about 6,800 people at the time. So there were multiple counties represented to go along with people that lived in the city of Lynchburg to make up the 11th Virginia. Now, we're going to follow three people primarily in the 11th Virginia. These accounts are found in the vertical files here at Gettysburg National Park and the library. And so we're going to look at this from a perspective of people that were here and walked the ground. We'll begin with Lieutenant John James. And I was reading a little bit on his biography. He did attend VMI and was there at the start of the war. He didn't complete graduation, but he was thought of very highly, and he was called to Richmond to help train new volunteers. He was given a gold ring. The family was very proud of that for his early on being called to mentor and train soldiers at the start of the war. And we're going to follow his account along with a couple of other accounts primarily. And he recalled before daylight on Friday the 3rd, that's July 3rd, 1863, that's the 11th Virginia of Kemper's Brigade, were put in motion, and before 10 o'clock a.m., we occupied the ground from which the charge was made. And I've taken the John Batchelder map from the late 1870s, the hour-by-hour map showing the early a.m. of July 3rd. And if you look at the top of the screen with my squiggly lines, you can see a red line running from left to right at the top. That's Old Mill Road. And one of my hopes one day is to do a battle walk along Old Mill Road, but it's a residential section now, But that was the primary route that Southerners came onto the battlefield. Old Mill Road was a feeder road right behind Seminary Ridge. And they turned onto the Fairfield Road and then turned south along what is now West Confederate Avenue. If you go down West Confederate Avenue and you look to your right or to the west, you'll catch glimpses of a horse trail there in the woods. And that horse trail that people traveled throughout the year as part of the touring of the park, at the time, that was the official road. It changes your perspective to go out and walk the horse trail and just try to mentally erase West Confederate Avenue. It even aligns the troops differently. If you line the troops along the horse trail rather than the markers that are along West Confederate, you can get a different perspective of where they were aiming, where they were looking, and so on. They followed what is today essentially that horse trail behind the cover of Seminary Ridge, using it like a curtain to not be seen by the signal stations at Little Round Top or Cemetery Hill. And then where I have them turning in, that's Spangler Lane to come into the Spangler Farm. The Florida Monument is there today. If you walk along West Confederate Avenue, you'll see the Florida Monument, and you can enter in there. The horse trail goes in that way. And that takes you out to the Emmitsburg Road. Now, one of the things I want you to notice, and this will be a paradigm change for you if you've never heard this before, is that Pickett's division was not formed behind the woods of Seminary Ridge, but they were formed behind the Emmitsburg Road. And their plumb bob chalk line, their axis of advance, was Spangler Lane, not the Virginia Memorial. All of this that I'm pointing out to you, where Pickett was deployed in the morning hours before Pickett's charge, is well south of the Virginia Memorial. So the area where they were enclosed. So they were not behind Seminary Ridge. They were not in the woods. They were out in the sunlight, deployed in the fields of the Spangler Farm. They were part of Kemper's brigade, and you can see the various regiments listed there, the 1st, the 3rd, 7th, 11th, 24th. They were the next to the last regiment on the far right, if you count Pettigrew and Trimble, of a mile-width line. They were the next to the last regiment. The 24th was on the very end, and then the 11th right beside them. So they're very, very extreme right, southern right. And that's Spangler Lane. Now, they didn't all just turn and file in on the lane in columns of 4 or anything like that. But that lane was their direction, so they would have been on the left and the right of it. Think of an airplane wing intersecting like a T with that particular lane. And Pickett's division would have been on the left and the right of that lane, guiding on it, using it as a central guiding line. And they would have come out into this field. That's the Spangler Farm. There are several Spangler Farms on the battlefield. The Foundation has the George Spangler Farm. This would have been the Henry Spangler Farm. And there was a well there, and the Southerners would have filled up their canteens right over here at the well. The barn, if we're being accurate here, was set fire to on the 2nd day of the battle, July 2nd, 1863. There was skirmishing there between Wilcox's Alabamians, and Union cavalry was there earlier in the day. And in that skirmishing, someone set fire to the barn. It must have been used as a place of cover and concealment to snipe. And so by the time Pickett's division filed in there, and you can see the Spangler Lane, they would have filed off to their right, your left, down in a swell on the other side of this little Emmitsburg Road ridge. There would have been a charred look to the barn, and there would have been bellows of black smoke coming out. There were a number of buildings that were set fire to along the Emmitsburg Road in no man's land. So Pickett's division deployed to either side of Spangler Lane under the cover of Emmitsburg Road, and this is a little bit more magnified than the last view. But here's Spangler Lane, here's the Emmitsburg Road. Virginia Memorial would be right here. This is well south of Virginia Memorial. So, and 11th Virginia, way down, the Eisenhower Farm is right here. They would be right about here. They were near the Millerstown Road. That's far ways from the angle, isn't it? I remember the first time I walked, I thought I was almost lost. I thought, oh my goodness, this was years ago. And this would have been their perspective behind the fence. If you read the Southern accounts, they talk about seeing lofty hills. We'll read such an account. They can see lofty hills on their front. Well, they can see Little Round Top off to the front there. And that's the Sherfy Farm. Mary and Joseph Sherfy's barn was burned on the 2nd day of the battle. So behind them, the 11th Virginia could see the remnants of the Spangler Farm charred and burned, smoke. And then to their front, they could see the Sherfy Farm barn had been burned to the ground. There were at least 13 people there that had burned alive, had crawled in there wounded on the 2nd day fight at the Peach Orchard. The famous Peach Orchard, Sickles' stance, and Kershaw's attack, and Barksdale's attack, that's right here. So the Southerners, and I'll just throw this in as added bonus material. When you think about Sickles' advance and the merits, pro and con, keep in mind the Southerners wanted this ridge as an artillery platform to attack Cemetery Ridge and Cemetery Hill. And so they used it for cover and concealment for their attack on the 3rd day. And their artillery, their 75 guns, were along the Emmitsburg Road Ridge. It was the only high ground between the two armies that was suitable for artillery. So it was like a dangling carrot that both sides thought they could use, and it never really worked like they thought it could. Now, Cadmus Wilcox, he would be part of the support troops on the far right. His troops, I'll explain exactly where they were in a few minutes, but they were right in front of the 11th Virginia, lying down behind the same Emmitsburg Road Ridge in the hours before Pickett's charge. And Cadmus Wilcox wrote, these 4 brigades, that's of Pickett's division, lay in position during the cannonade that preceded the attack. Pickett's right brigade, Kemper's, lost near 200, the other brigades much less. So he includes his own brigade there in the discussion. Lost near 200, the other brigades much less. From these 4 brigades, the enemy's line directly in front was some 700 or 800 yards. As an important nugget here, he mentions lost near 200. If you read through the Southern accounts, they don't tell you how many they lost in the cannonade. That's all configured in with their general losses in the charge. But you get a sense that Kemper's brigade suffered considerably more during the cannonade than anyone else. And some of you already know that. But because Alexander's guns were right in front of them at the top of the ridge, on the Emmetsburg Road Ridge, they were the direct overshot from incoming fire from guns that were firing from Cemetery Ridge. So the overshots hit them first, and they were just right in the line of fire because of the diagonal fire from Cemetery Ridge to the southwest in the direction of the Eisenhower Farm and the direction of where Kemper's brigade was. So they caught all the overshots. Longstreet at one point, you remember how General Hancock rode the lines during Pickett's charge on the Union side, and somebody asked him why you did that. It was the worst cannonade in the history of the Western Hemisphere. Why would you do that? And what was his response? Yeah, Corps Command's life does not matter. He showed an example for them. He risked his life back and forth, riding back and forth along Cemetery Ridge, so Union soldiers clutching to the ground behind them, struggling with fight or flight, could look up and see the person that commanded just putting his life at risk over and over. Longstreet did the same thing. He rode back and forth along the ridge I showed you in the last slide. And those who saw that never forgot it, and it was to stabilize them. Cadmus Wilcox said orders were given to Major General Pickett to form his line under the best cover he could get from the enemy's batteries, and so that the center of the assaulting column could arrive at the salient of the enemy's position. And when you think of the salient, you think of what? The angle. But again, this may be a paradigm shift for you. Cadmus Wilcox writes, beyond the Emmetsburg pike, that's the enemy's line, converged upon the pike, that's the Emmetsburg Road, towards the town and touched it near the cemetery, or came within a very short distance of it. The cemetery was near a mile from Pickett's left. As Pickett's left was to be the center of the column of attack, the difficulty, if not impossibility, of executing his orders is obvious, the salient being the cemetery. So the ultimate objective of Pickett's charge was what is now the National Cemetery. And the attacks up the Emmetsburg Road were meant to create in successive echelon attacks to take the main Cemetery Hill. The point of assault was Cemetery Ridge, but the chain reaction further up the line was to take the main Cemetery Hill. Before Longstreet met with Lee and they argued about involving McLaws and Hood's divisions in the attack, prior to that, Lee wanted Hood and McLaws to start the attack up the Emmetsburg Road, and then Pickett was to be aligned right in front of Cemetery Hill. Pickett's original alignment, before the plan was tinkered with, Pickett was to align in front of what is now the Bryan Farm, between the Bryan Farm and where the cemetery annex was, in that area there. And McLaws and Hood were to attack up the Emmetsburg Road towards them, and they were to seize the main Cemetery Hill after McLaws and Hood drew the initial Union defense further south along the Emmetsburg Road. All the attacks for 2 days were up the Emmetsburg Road. The attack in the Peach Orchard, the wheat field, the Cadore Thicket, Cemetery Ridge, they were all guiding on the Emmetsburg Road. No different with Pickett's charge. Pickett's troops turned in oblique because they were guiding on the Emmetsburg Road towards their objective, Cemetery Hill. They were going to try to draw Union defenders down to defend Cemetery Ridge. A.P. Hill, once Longstreet decided he was not going to allow McLaws and Hood to support Pickett in what is now Pickett's charge, Longstreet decided that he wanted to defend his flank. Lee took all of his cavalry and put it east of Gettysburg to be able to chase down wagon trains during a retreat. you shoot the horses, set fire to wagons, try to create panic during a retreat if the Cemetery Hill line broke. The Southern Cavalry was placed east of Gettysburg to follow roads that would intercept a retreat along the Baltimore Pike near the Maryland line and points where all the wagons were, and to try to create mayhem, chaos, panic, and that sort of thing. Well, because Lee put all his eggs in one basket and put all of his cavalry east of Gettysburg, he had no cavalry covering his right flank. So Longstreet decided Hood's division would cover the right flank. Well, McLaws couldn't support Pickett and leave contact with Hood. He had to stay with Hood. So once Longstreet insisted on that, Pickett needed help, and that's when A.P. Hill's troops were brought into the fight. They were moved directly in front of Cemetery Hill, where Pickett was supposed to be originally. Pickett was to attack Cemetery Ridge, draw all the Union defenders there, and then attacks further up the line. Pettigrew, Trimble, Rhodes, Early were to go in and take the main Cemetery Hill. So anyway, the salient, what he's saying here to you is that if you look off in the distance, you can see Cemetery Hill. This is Emmitsburg Road Ridge. The Southerners are behind the ridge. The artillery for the Southern attack was here. What Cadmus Wilcox was saying, and Edward Porter Alexander said the same thing in his writings, is Longstreet had positioned them in a way with A.P. Hill on their left where the objective, the main cemetery, was just far away. It was too far away, they felt. They had been put in a place to cooperate with A.P. Hill that was beyond being able to go directly at Cemetery Hill. Captain James Risk Hutter, they called him Risk, R-I-S-K. He was also a VMI and UVA graduate, was commenting on the direct sunlight while they waited in the morning hours behind the Emmitsburg Road Ridge, deployed, waiting for their artillery to start. He wrote, "The sun was insufferably hot, there being behind my right wing of the regiment a large apple tree. I enjoyed its shade with Captain John C. Granberry." The people of Lynchburg that he was writing to knew Granberry. He was a bishop there at the time with the Methodist Episcopal Church. And so you can see that Hutter is very proud of saying that he sat down. But my emphasis here is on that they're out in the open heat. They're not in the woods. A lot of folks think that Pickett's troops were concealed in the woods, and they were not. They were out in the heat. And they talked about that over and over again. They had sunstroke problems. And Hutter recalled between 12 and 1 o'clock the artillery opened. 1 o'clock is the hour generally occurred in, he writes. I never before or since heard such a cannonade from our front and right flank. Shot, shell, grape, canister poured, and none will ever know how many men we lost there, not only from the shot and shell of the enemy, but from the terrific heat of the sun's rays. Again, they emphasize the heat. And I have deep in my DNA, I love that heat. I've done battle walks out here for many years, and there's something soothing about that warmth, and I've gotten used to it. But there are some days, and Chris will tell you this, where it's insufferably hot here, and we put up the red flag and we call off the tours. I'm sure these soldiers wanted to call off the attack. Lieutenant John James, we mentioned him earlier. He had attended VMI, got a gold ring. He remembered in a few seconds their solid shot was tearing up the ground around us and their shells bursting in our very faces. If you go on to read all of the Southern accounts and Union accounts, they have one thing in common without collaborating, and it is the sulfurous smoke created such a thick veil that the sun looked like a red ball. You read that over and over and over again. You remember the eclipse a few years ago, and we had to wear glasses in the middle of the day, or when you have a lot of wildland fires out west, and you can see the sun and it changes color because of the smoke, even out west. It got dark here, almost as dark as an eclipse, and there's a view out towards the Klingel farm, the Daniel Klingel farm, which was directly in front of them. That's the Emmitsburg Road Ridge where all the artillery was. And imagine Longstreet riding back and forth. And if you're a right-brain visual person, I'll add this accent to it. Mostly the Southerners had Napoleon smooth brass bore guns, and they're tarnished green today, but back then they would have been a gold color. So there would have been a glint from them. It would give you a headache if you looked at them in the wrong direction. But the smoke would have broken a lot of that up. Sulfur smells like a rotten egg. The smells would have been very bad. And I'll say this too as I go back here, just to tell you how did they deal with that. You know how we have masks on here, and back then what Pickett's troops did, and Wilcox's Alabamians did this, and the Floridians who were attached to him did this too on the same slope. They dug the mold of their face and then put a handkerchief over their face so the dirt wouldn't get in their face, and then they could breathe cooler earth because they said that the grass was suffocating. It was tall, and it just tended to trap the heat. Wilcox's men who were in front of Pickett's troops were down here near the bottom, intersecting with Spangler Lane. Wilcox's troops were over here, and then Lang's troops here, Floridians here, lying down. They had cut out body molds so that when Pickett advanced, Pickett could trade places with them on the front line by merely stepping in the middle of their back and leapfrogging over them. So that's the way, just like in the wheat field when Caldwell's division replaced Tilton and Schweitzer, they did the same thing. Tilton and Schweitzer just laid closely. It had nothing to do with cowardice. They were just laying down to trade places, trade shifts on the front line. Something very similar happened. On the first day of the battle, Pettigrew's troops, I should say Heath's division, they laid down after they attacked Hearp's Wood so Pender could step on their backs and replace them without any lost time on the front lines. That was common. Okay, Hutter, Risk, as they called him, writes, our chaplain, the Reverend John C. Granberry, whenever he saw a man badly wounded, would go and kneel by him and pray for and with him. I remember many men were unable to go by reason of the heat. I would appeal to them in the name of Virginia to go if possible. I was talking with one of Captain John Holmes Smith's Company G men and urging him to go, if possible. Captain Smith said, Colonel Hutter, when he says he is sick, he is sick. So they were in different ways trying to get them to go forward. Just like on the Union side, they heard, remember your wives and your children. They heard over and over again things to stabilize them. Cadmus Wilcox, who commanded the reserve troops that would support Pickett's right flank, who were lying down initially in front of them, wrote, when the order to advance was given, Pickett's center brigade marched over Wilcox's men who lay down for that purpose. They then changed direction to the left by a wheel. This threw one brigade in rear. Now this may mess with your paradigm a little bit, but Pickett's troops didn't go over across the field side by side. They, when Garnett's brigade, which was on the left, obliqued, that is, turned 30 degrees, and then over time it drifts into 45 degrees. And so it's usually between 30 and 45. You cut off the turn at 30 and let it drift into 45. If you cut it off at, if you give the order to turn it a full 45, they'll end up coming back. So you have to try to control that tilt. So when Garnett turned left, that immediately, this is Kemper, this is Garnett. When Garnett turned, that immediately threw Kemper to the right rear. Does that make sense? And that's how you attack with echelon attacks anyway. Echelon attacks are meant to draw attention to the first brigade that arrives. Usually the defender will overcommit to the first attack. And then that allows troops further up the line to find a breakthrough because there are fewer reserves because they've been overcommitted to the first attack. That's why you attack in chain reaction. To get a breakthrough somewhere up the line, you hope your opponent mismanages their troops in stopping the first attacks and has fewer to stop you further up the line. That's why the attack was to start at Cemetery Ridge, and then the breakthrough would occur somewhere further north, closer to Cemetery Hill. This is a sketch by Charles Reed showing Pickett's troops at the oblique, and you can see the Emmitsburg Road. He's tried to create a three-dimensional sketch. Charles Reed was in the 9th Massachusetts Battery. Excellent sketch artist. And the Emmitsburg Road, that would be the, more than likely, the Rogers House, which was a small white frame house, and then further up the Kadori House. And you can see Cemetery Hill way up here. The burning Bliss Farm over here to your left is identified right up here. That's another building that was set fire to. It's just plumes of black smoke and a blaze coming out of the Bliss Farm. It was used as sharpshooting in the morning closer to Alexander Hayes's front. Captain Robert Mitchell of Company A claimed, and by the way, he was in charge of the 11th Virginia at Antietam near the Burnside Bridge. He supported A.P. Hill there in the defense there, fought alongside Toombs and A.P. Hill. And he wrote, I distinctly can see General Pickett even now when closing my eyes an instant, when on his horse with slouch not held high aloft, give the command, division, left oblique, march. It was heard over the field, and the order obeyed as well as on parade. Now, there is an interesting detail here. He says that the slouch, that presumably the slouch hat, that it's not held high. And that might give us a clue as to where General Pickett was. And it's a very minor clue, but people want to know where he was during the charge. Why would he not hold the slouch hat high? You become a target. There were Union skirmishers all along the Emmitsburg Road as the initial defense they had to break through. So wherever he was, he didn't hold it very high. He just tried to get their attention. And then they remembered the left oblique. And some of that was probably enhanced in their imaginations over the years, but probably some people heard it. Certainly it happened. And you can see this is the Forbes sketch. Painting. It was originally a sketch, and then he evolved it into a painting. And I've used it as a backdrop for a Captain Robert Mitchell quote. Robert Mitchell, Company A, reflected, by the perfect execution of the left oblique movement under fire of cannon and musketry, they had exhibited that division was shell-disciplined and finished soldiers. What he's telling you here is that they had learned through muscle memory to do the right thing when the mind shuts down. That's, if you've been in the Army or the Marine Corps, that's the whole point of boot camp, is to train you over and over and over, climbing over obstacles and ropes and crawling under barbed wire and marching and drilling. It's so that when your mind shuts down with cortisol and adrenaline and you feel like you're going to fall over from vertigo because your head's flooded with chemicals from fight with or flee from in a battle, you do the right thing without thinking about it. And so he's saying that this group here, the rest of the war, they proved that they could function in the worst conditions. Now, what I want you to see in the picture is Pickett's troops coming in from the oblique, and this is the Emmitsburg Road Ridge. Can you see them coming in from the oblique? Pickett's division was attacking up the Emmitsburg Road. And the Southerners talk about, or I read a little bit earlier from Wilcox's account, and he said he talks about them converging on the pike and following it essentially to where it meets the Union line in the area of Cemetery Ridge further north, and that it was rather far to the left, and they worried whether they would never even get there. The point is they were guiding on the Emmitsburg Road. That was the point of direction for the attack. So here comes Pickett's troops coming in from the oblique, and this is Pettigrew and Trimble's troops going in here. In the original design, Pickett's troops would have been stationed here, and McLaws would have been coming up on their right. Okay, and this is more than likely Wright's Georgia Brigade waiting in reserve. They would be eventually placed over on the right to support Pickett's right during the retreat. And this is a view looking by Edwin Forbes from the other direction, from the Union perspective. And I found this so interesting. Sometimes we think this is the copse of trees, but it's actually Ziegler's Grove. And you know where the Lincoln Speech Memorial is, the bust that we're to commemorate Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, put there in 1912. It's just inside the cemetery entrance along Tawnytown Road. That's where the artist is standing. He must have walked over here after the attack. Being a non-combatant, he would have been allowed to go through the lines and stand from right about where the Lincoln Speech Memorial is and the World War II and Vietnam markers there in the cemetery. And then the cemetery parking lot's right here. And this is the 125th and 126th New York, along with the 8th Ohio, which is down here, flanking, and this would be Woodruff's guns here at Ziegler's Grove. Isn't that fascinating to look at it from a Union perspective? If you go back to the Southern perspective, you can see the same trees from the reverse direction. Union veterans argued after the war which trees the Southerners were aiming for. The traditional copse of trees are Ziegler's Grove. Howard thought it was Ziegler's Grove. Clinton McDougal of the 111th New York said it was Ziegler's Grove. 69th Pennsylvania said it was copse of trees. The Southerners don't say anything about the trees. They talk about the Emmitsburg Road. Norborne Berkeley of the 8th Virginia said they marched towards a conspicuous red building. Well, that would be the Kadoorie House. And why would they go there? Because it's the only building not burned in no man's land where they could get some temporary cover before they attacked. And it was easy to see in the smoke. Okay, Lieutenant James remembered immediately in our front was a range of lofty hills, and a little distance beyond and above the foot of these hills was posted the enemy strongly entrenched. Now, this is the Emmitsburg Road Ridge where the cannons were. The Washington Artillery of New Orleans would have been here with their bronze cannons, some cases partially red from the heat of having fired in a 2-hour cannonade. This is the Emmitsburg Road. Pickett's troops were already obliquing at that point to guide on this road. And this is the area of the Kadoorie buildings that many would seek shelter. Cemetery Hill is back here. Off in the distance, Culp's Hill. There's the beautiful Pennsylvania Memorial. And then the United States Monument, U.S. Regular Monument, the area of the Angle today. This whole area right here, Cemetery Ridge, was entrenched. The Union had improved the walls there by digging in front of the walls so you could get an extra half a foot or foot, packing the dirt in the walls to make them strong. Part of the wall today in front of Harrow's line is still there, but it's buried under dirt. So they would have packed it with dirt. They cut branches down, and this is what you did before barbed wire. You put the branches out in front of the wall, stick them in to make the wall like the back of a porcupine. The Southerners would be able to remove those sticks, but you might be able to fire, if you're Union defender, 69th, 71st, 72nd, 59th New York. If you're able to fire a couple volleys, 3 volleys before those sharpened abattis are removed, it could be the difference in breaking the line, breaking morale. So some Southerners that had been laying down all day in the low ground, when they got to the top of this ridge, it was the first time they could actually see the Union line. And it would have been, oh my God, this is what we're up against. A.L. Long, Armistead Long, he was Lee's military secretary. He was with him throughout the war and wrote all of his memorandums. He wrote a book after the war called Lee's Memoirs. After Lee died, his wife, Robert E. Lee's wife, gave his papers to Long and said, you were with him every day, would you write? So there is a book called Lee's Memoirs. It was written by his military secretary, A.L. Long. And in Lee's Memoirs, Long writes, there was, however, a weak point where the Cemetery Ridge, sloping westward, formed the depression through which the Emmitsburg Road passes. See, they're guiding on the Emmitsburg Road. Perceiving that by forcing the Federal lines at that point, that's the Emmitsburg Road, and turning toward Cemetery Hill, would be taken in flank, and remainder would be neutralized, as its fire would be as destructive to friend as foe, generally determined to attack at that point. Now, by flank, what they're talking about is Pickett's division originally wanted to flank where the Vermont Brigade was, on the southern end of the ridge, the area of the Pennsylvania Memorial, just a little bit north of there, and roll the line, sweep it up Cemetery Ridge. And the reason they also obliqued was for that reason, to try to come in by flank. Wilcox was to follow with his Alabamians and Floridians and protect Pickett's back so they could sweep up the ridge towards Pettigrew. Pettigrew and Pickett's wings were 400 yards apart. There are 2 ways to close a gap in your line. One is to dress right and left and just connect. The other is to attack from widely separated wings on a central point. And so that's how they plan to unite. If you attack up the Emmitsburg Road, you're going to find your neighbor on your left eventually. Just like a tropical storm gains water as it goes over the Gulf before it dumps on Houston, for instance, it gets more and more warm water as it goes across the Gulf. In similar fashion, as echelon attacks get stronger in critical mass towards the objective point. Now, the weak point that he was talking about that they could go through was the low ground in front of Cemetery Ridge. I may not get back to that point, but it's something to chew on. James Risk Hunter, Risk, said early in the charge, the 11th Regiment encountered a white weather-boarded house with a paling enclosing a small yard. The adjutant, Lieutenant Valentine, or they would say in German, Valentin Harris, having told me that Colonel Odie said I should maneuver my wing around the house, I remarked that it ought. All right, now the house that he's most likely talking about doesn't stand anymore. It would have been where this white fencing is along the Emmitsburg Road. It was the Rogers farmhouse, and Josephine Rogers Miller, her married name being Miller, was there baking bread. A number of wounded went in, and you could smell baked bread if you got near the house. But according to Risk Hunter, when he got to this portion of the line, he was in charge of the right half of the 11th Virginia. He said he was told by Colonel Kirkwood Odie to take his right wing of the 11th Virginia, that's Hunter's right wing, and go around the barn. And he had trouble doing that, around the house and the barn. And in this particular Alfred Ward painting from the Union perspective, this might be the building. And this might be a representation of the 11th Virginia, at least part of Kemper's line, having to navigate around the building as they proceeded up the Emmitsburg Road. Notice they're coming in at the oblique. They're not coming directly at the Union line. They're coming in diagonally. Okay, because it's a sweeping maneuver towards Pettigrew's front and towards Cemetery Hill. Captain Hutter continues to be a regimental movement as the obstacle was too large for a wing movement. However, I gave the command by right of company to the front. Company's face was not large enough to the obstacle, so I had to order two of my captains to march right and left respectively. What he was saying is they ordered a right face, march by the right face, and they didn't go far enough to clear the building, and so then suddenly they were standing in front of it and it was an obstacle. So as to pass the obstacle after passing it, I was advised by the adjutant of the wounding of Colonel Odie and that I was in command and that my time was absorbed in reforming the right wing from the maneuver around the house. The Yankee fire was now galling. I called upon the adjutant. And this is a view from G.G. Benedict's History of the Vermont Brigade showing Standard's Vermonters on the southern end of Cemetery Ridge in the area just north of where the Minnesota Monument is and the Pennsylvania Monument. And you can see Pickett coming in again at the oblique. They're just marching right in front of them. What had happened was on your left, McGilvery's guns advanced up to a certain point and fired right down Pickett's line, cutting through sometimes 3 men at a time, amputating men's legs with one shot. And the Southerners were not able to flank the Union, get behind them, crossfire from the front and back, and roll the line up Cemetery Ridge. Standard stopped that. Hancock went down to make sure McGilvery and Standard worked to stop that. And they put the Confederates out in the low ground, which they wanted to be in, under Union guns. That was the weak point the Southerners were looking for, go through low ground to get under the Union guns and come in diagonally. By the way, if you come in diagonally, the guns on Cemetery Hill couldn't fire at Pickett's troops because Ziegler's Grove was in their way. So generally he found one chink in the Union armor, and that was right just beyond the Cadore buildings. There's some low ground to get under the guns, come in diagonally, cut in half Union artillery fire, and sweep the Union line by flank, where Union troops further north would have to fire across the bodies of their own troops further south of Cemetery Ridge just to hit troops, Southern troops flanking them from the south. Captain Hutter said to bring Captain Jones to command the right wing. He informed me that Captain Jones was wounded. I called for Captain G.G. Houston. He was killed. Then I called for Andrew Houston. His brother was reported killed. To add to my discomfort, the pressure from our right was so heavy that it almost amounted to a left oblique. He almost had to make another left oblique to avoid Standard's fire and McGilvery's fire right into his flank. Hutter completes, he says, at this time, Colonel Lewis B. Williams, commanding the 1st Infantry, that's the regiment on their left, immediately on my left, rode up to me and said, Colonel Hutter, can you do nothing with your men? They are crowding me out of line. And the cyclorama painting demonstrates that pretty well. You can see the Southerners guiding on the Emmitsburg Road in the cyclorama. Does everybody see that? That's the avenue of access towards Cemetery Ridge, sweep up towards Pettigrew's front, and echelons towards Cemetery Hill, where A.P. Hill's waiting there on standby. And as they're proceeding up the Emmitsburg Road, When they get into this area here, south of the area of the copse of trees, right about where the 59th New York Monument is, the 20th Massachusetts Monument, Southerners call that area the slashing. The Union had gone out and sharpened all these small trees, small oak trees and cedar trees, down to just sharpened spikes. It would be like walking through the woods after the woods have been cleared, but the brush hasn't been cleared up, and you don't have brush pants and you don't have steel-tip shoes, and you step on it and get impaled. Again, that's what you did before barbed wire. There were accidents, and the Southerners were their legs were getting lacerated in that area, and the Vermonters were getting around their flank and driving them into this area right here called the slashing, where many of them would eventually surrender, maybe 1,000, many of them right in that area. But you can see the crowding and the crushing that's going on at this point because their flanks collapsing. Captain Robert Mitchell, Company A, 11th Virginia, later claimed it looked to me that every friend I had was gone. Early in the charge, I was struck in the right arm and my sword dropped. I remember thinking of my brother John's death and asking myself why I didn't retire from the field. By the way, that's fight or flight. He's going back and forth. Do I go forward? Do I not go forward? And he's trained to go forward. I continued to advance, and though hit again with a piece of shell, I was the ranking officer who ordered the retreat. That's how many people were wounded. He found himself suddenly in charge of the regiment, what was left of it. Lieutenant James writes, at every step some poor fellow would fall, and his pitiful cry would come to my ear, and I almost imagined it, the wail of some loved one he had left at home. And if you talk to veterans, most veterans don't want to talk about this, but that happens. Somebody's wounded next to them, and they just start crying like a baby, and they know it's over. And he would have heard you hear that over and over and over again. That's why veterans have trouble going into the cyclorama program here. Once the cannons start to fire, if they've seen combat, it can be related in their memory through PTSD back to those sounds that they block out. And you can see a picture of the base of the Virginia Monument of the Sons of Virginia that were commemorated in 1917 with that monument. So you can see a Southern mechanic and a professional, probably a lawyer, an artist. You can see here a mechanic, a farmer, a young lad, and also another young lad. And if you look at the soldiers in the 11th Virginia, they represented all of society that way. There were skilled artisans, there were mechanics, there were farmers. Lieutenant James reflected, some of the men had taken possession of the cannon when we saw the enemy advancing heavy reinforcements. We looked back for hours, but in vain. We were compelled to fall back. Oh, it was hard to be compelled to give way for the want of men, and having fought as hard as we had that day. So if you were the Southerners in that jumbled mass at the slashing, and you looked back, you could see Wright's brigade coming up to support you, but they stopped at 500 yards. They were only going to go forward and leapfrog over you and continue the pursuit had your attack worked. So that tells you if you're at the wall, the supports are waiting for you to fall back on them. Why 500 yards? Because panic, cortisol and adrenaline will wear off over 500 yards. So panic won't metastasize the regiments that haven't been in the fight. So they try to keep the spacing to protect the panic from occurring. And this soldier looks back and sees that they've stopped, the reserves have stopped at 500 yards and they're not coming forward. That means you got to get out the best way you can. And about 1,000 of them just come out with white handkerchiefs and they take their boots off and put them on the brogans and put them on the end of their rifle and hold them up. It's so loud on the battlefield you can't hear. Soldiers' ears are clogged with cloth because if they don't, it'll rupture their eardrums. Sometimes they'll have nosebleeds from concussions from the noise. So there are these nonverbals. You just start to wave something or hold up a shoe, and then about 1,000 surrendered there. First Lieutenant Robert Mitchell recollected, I was the ranking officer who ordered the retreat of the remnant of Pickett's division. I would retreat 100 yards, order a halt, fire at the advancing blue line, which would stop to close their files knocked out, and when it halted, I would order a further retreat. A fourth of the division was thus saved from capture. This is a sketch from the 106th Pennsylvania Monument near the High Water Mark Monument. Isn't it a beautiful work of art? And it shows the Kadori building, the only one that hadn't been burned. The barn is much bigger and red now. Then it was a small gray barn. The Southerners used that as a way to retreat, to block direct Southern Union fire pursuit. And according to Mitchell, he said the 11th Virginia remnants would turn in fire periodically and then continue to fall back all the way to the Spangler Farm. Out of 405 soldiers who began the charge, 250 stood for the roll call. Altogether, 26 killed, 65 wounded, 42, I got an extra number there, 42 wounded and captured, and 22 captured. And that's the story of the 11th Virginia, who we followed in Pickett's charge. Thank you for coming out to the first winter lecture. And then I'll hang around if you want to come up and talk for a while.